Welcome to AP Biology. Today we're going to talk about reproductive isolating mechanisms. So this is any of a number of things that keeps populations separate, and so that we would define them as different species. So you can have a population of very diverse looking organisms, but if they can all mate and make fertile babies, if they can all interbreed or mate and make fertile babies, we're going to call them the same species. If you have populations of organisms that look alike, like I think the birds look kind of alike, but if they don't mate with each other or they don't mate and make fertile babies, we're going to call them different species. So we have the Bullock's oriole and the Baltimore oriole, and they don't mate and make fertile babies. Otherwise, they wouldn't be considered different species. So reproductive isolating mechanisms. When you're isolated, you're all alone. That's not what it means here. It means you're isolated, your group is isolated from another group. So maybe you're in the same area, but you don't mate and make babies. So it keeps the populations apart so that they're not the same species. So reproductive isolating mechanisms prevent gene flow. So gene flow is when you have individuals from one population mating and making babies with the other one, either pollen from um, from flowers is moved from one field to another, or bird flies from one area to another. But reproductive isolating mechanisms keep gene flow from happening. So it keeps these populations apart so that these differences can build up and you get a new species. So there are reproductive isolating mechanisms that stop all species from reproducing with each other. And these reproductive isolating mechanisms are important in the development of the new species as well. So there are two basic types. There's prezygotic and postzygotic. So a zygote, remember, is a fertilized egg. So prezygotic is anything that happens before a zygote is even made. So there are a bunch of examples of that. Temporal just means time. And so that just means the potential mates are in the same area, but they reproduce at different times, maybe different times of day, certainly, or different times of the year. So here is a type of frog, the Rana boylii, and it breeds in March to May. And then here's a closely related type of frog, I guess, that breeds January to March instead of March to May. So maybe January to early March and then late March to May. So they just mate at different times. Notice the genus is the same, Rana, but the species are different. So the way we name these is not really something we spend much time on in AP Bio, but this is the species name, and if they have a different species name, we're going to say that they're different species, and so they don't mate and produce fertile babies. So why is it in this case? Well, at least in part, it's temporal isolation. They don't mate at the same time of the year. Another example of a prezygotic isolating mechanism is behavioral isolation. So it could be that if they did get together and mate, they'd make fertile offspring, but something about the behavior stops them from mating. So maybe a female of a bird who's a female of a population that's closely related to this bird might look at the bird and think it's got pretty feathers, but maybe it doesn't dance just the right way. That's part of a behavior, right? And so if they don't behave the right way, they're not going to mate. Another is mechanical isolation. So maybe the potential mates want to mate with each other, but the sperm can't be fertilized. The sperm can't be transferred successfully to the egg. So Ariel might want to make babies with Eric, but their parts don't fit. Mechanical isolation. Okay, gametic mortality is another prezygotic reproductive isolating mechanism because they get together and mate, but they don't actually make a zygote because the sperm maybe don't have the right proteins on the surface. And so while they might not have the right proteins on the surface of the sperm, and so the egg doesn't let it in because there should be some kind of receptor here that recognizes the sperm and allows it to get in. Okay, also ecological isolation. This just means that the mates don't really occupy the same habitats within the same area. So there's some kind of a niche separation. So maybe these two different frogs live in the same area and maybe they even mate at the same time, but one of them mates in fast moving streams and the other one mates in like a kind of permanent ponds without a lot of fast moving water. Okay, those were all pre. Now we're going to talk about postzygotic. That means the potential mates get together, they mate, they make a zygote. So they make a fertilized egg. But maybe the zygote dies. So zygote mortality means the zygote is made, but it dies as an early embryo usually. Hybrid inviability means the hybrid is born, so the organism, the baby is born, but it's not strong, so maybe it can't get food on its own, or maybe it's weaker for whatever reason, and it just doesn't survive super well. And finally, hybrid sterility. So sterility, you might think of something as being sterile if the bacteria and the viruses are all killed. Like if you wash your hands, you make them pretty sterile, right? I mean, not completely, but that might be what you're thinking. Like if you sanitize the table with some kind of a spray cleaner, maybe you sterilized it, meaning it doesn't have bacteria. Here, sterility just means it can't make babies. So um, the hybrid is born. So the two potential mates get together, they mate, they make the baby, and the baby hybrid grows up, but it's sterile. So the hybrid's robust, but it's either sterile or partially so, meaning their fertility is lower. So anything that decreases fertility is going to help to keep the two populations apart. So examples of this would be a horse and a donkey. We would say they're two different species, even though they look a lot alike. I'm sure they have a common ancestor that looked a lot like them, but they're different species now because when they make a mule, the mule is a really good animal, strong, um, certainly not inviable. They don't die. They're good work animals, but they're sterile. So we would consider these two to be different species. However, they were probably the same species, in the not too distant past. Ligers are another example. They're a cross between a male ligon and a female tiger, as opposed to tigons. I think they have reduced fertility, so that would mean that a tiger and a lion are pretty much different species. Okay, last one is this idea called a ring species, and I'm just bringing this up because it's just a really cool example of how in biology we tend to try to categorize life so that we can understand it, and we make these definitions that nature is sometimes like, yeah, I don't think so. So the definition of a species is that it's um, organisms that can mate and produce viable and fertile babies, right? And so here's an example of some salamanders, and here's the Monterey salamander, and it lives here. And there's a little spot right here where the large blotched salamander lives. And this spot right here is where the two populations come together. And they can mate and make fertile babies. And that's also true of the yellow-eyed salamander and the Monterey salamander. So when they get together, they can mate and make fertile babies. And they also live here, kind of cool. Oregon populations live here, I guess, like this. And so when the Oregon and the yellow-eyed uh, salamanders get together, wow, sorry, they can mate and make fertile babies. I don't know what I'm touching here to mess up, but anyway, the Sierra Nevada population lives here, and when there's an area, a location where the Oregon and the Sierra Nevada population gets together, they can mate and make fertile babies. And same here with the yellow blotched salamanders. When they get together, when they get together with the Sierra Nevada ones, they can mate and make fertile babies. Okay, then there's this gap in the ring right here. And so the large, oh, that's okay. The large blotched salamanders and the yellow blotched salamanders, when they get together, well, they don't get together, right? Because why can I not do this? I think I have to go back like this. Okay, so when these two, well, they would never get together, right? Because there's this space between them. But let's say you picked up some of these and moved them here. If these two found each other, they wouldn't be able to mate and make fertile babies. So that is called a ring species. So we are going to call this still a species, but imagine that this population dies out, and this population dies out, and this population dies, and this population dies. If all you're left with is the yellow blotched population and the large blotched population, we would consider these different species because they can't mate and make fertile babies. So that's a weird one for you. All right, bye.